Okay, this is a video that's going over Pierre Bourdieu's Fields and Rules. It's something that it's a theory by Bourdieu to try to get you to get to a deeper level on when we read books. Okay, so each book is a kind of field which has rules, and so let's first go over this whole idea of fields and rules. Each and every social situation. So Bourdieu, he's talking about relationships of people and power and all this. He's actually a postmodernist, and so he goes into probability and things like that. But anyway, but the one sort of idea that I'm using from him, which is pretty a powerful idea, is this idea of fields. So each and every social situation can be considered a field, that is a place where there's human interaction. Whatever happens on the field must occur according to set rules. I'm going to give you examples in a moment, so let's just get through this first. So every situation is a field, and then there are rules which govern the behavior on that field. You can think of athletic fields, but also when you're hanging out with your friends, what is the right way to do things and what are the wrong ways of doing things. So violations of rules result in some kind of penalty or loss of credibility. So there are violations and penalties in sports. There are violations and penalties among your friends, right? So you lied to your friend, for example, or whatever, right? So, or you stole from one of your friends. Well, then there's a kind of a loss of credibility, or there's a kind of a penalty that's going on there. Now, all players on the field must abide by the same set of rules. Okay, so you can't say, well, you have to follow the rules, and I can't. So it's the hypocrisy thing. Okay, changing rules can only happen through the rule makers, and so who are the rule makers? Those are people who are the experts of the field, or in the case of your family, then it would be your parents. If it was the United States, it would be Congress. Okay, if it was a company, then it would be the company itself, also within reason of the rules of the country. In the academic world, you have to be one of the premier academicians. You have to be one of the expert to be able to say that the rules have to change. Spectators, that is, most of us are going to be spectators. Most of you, I think, are going to be spectators throughout us, me included, are going to be spectators. We're not experts, but then you don't really need to understand everything because you're just spectating. Okay, so how, as non-experts, as spectators, can we engage with the material that we're going to be reading this semester? Now, just like in everything else, ability comes through knowledge of the rules, right? But also mastery of the skills. So if we were to use football as an example, so there are a lot of rules in football, so you got to know what the rules are. But at the same time, you have to have skills to be able to compete on that field. All right. So all of us can play football if we had to, but not all of us would be very good. Okay. Also, think in terms of school. You may know what the rules are, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to excel, that you're going to be the best student in the school, right? The smartest kid, if we were to use old school nomenclature. But that's the idea, that it's a combination of knowing the rules and mastering skills. So examples of fields. So like I said, football, lacrosse. Now, the interesting thing is you have to realize that the football field is different from, let's say, a baseball field. You can't mix the two, right? They are their own unique fields. So you can't go on a football field and say home run, or you can't go on a baseball field and say touchdown. Everyone will kind of look at you strange and weird because that's not part of the rules. It's a different field. And so therefore, the terminology is different. The rules are different. How you determine success or failure in those fields, completely different. Now, as you go through your day, you actually go from field to field. Sometimes you're functioning on two different fields at the same time. always following the rules for each. And so you can't mix football and baseball, but you can mix social fields. So that is the field, uh, how you behave with your friends. But then if you meet your parents, like let's just say you invited all your friends to your house, if you were just there, just you and your friends, the way you would behave, the way you would act would be one way. But then all of a sudden, if your parents came home or they came into the room, then the rules change. So right now you have two different fields going on, but of course you have to follow the rules of the dominant rule makers, right? And in this case, it should be your parents, right? So now you have to follow the rules, or at least respect the person's parents, okay? And so you're on two different fields, but then you kind of figure out which rules you have to be following. Sitting in the classroom, you may be with your friends, but now you're in the classroom, so you have to follow the rules of the classroom, okay? Same with any situation, right? So whenever two fields collide, you have to figure out which rules you have to follow. Now, walking to the next class while talking to your friend. Well, there are rules of exiting a classroom. There are rules of walking down a corridor. There are rules of walking up the steps, up and down the steps, getting on an elevator while talking to your friend. Crossing the street as well at home with your parents or in the dorm. Now remember, anyone who is wrong, you know this, right? So when you say, "Oh, that person's so rude," or "that person's disgusting," or whatever, then what you're actually doing is saying that there are rules. There's the right way of doing things, and then there's the wrong way. A lot of people who come from different countries encounter this, right? What was normal where they were from is now kind of rude or disgusting in the new location, right? But that phenomena kind of lets you know and realize that there are fields, different fields, which have different rules. And so people who don't know the rules, who don't care about the rules, they get a lot of things said about them. Also, what's interesting too is critiquing one field from another field. It's kind of a silly exercise. When you look at it this way, it's kind of silly. I'll give you a common argument that I hear, at least when I was younger: who's the greatest athlete ever? And so people will be naming boxers, people will name hockey players, football players, whatever, which is apples to oranges, right? You cannot compare. Well, people try, but and they use certain kinds of rubrics to do so. But to try to compare, what's going on in one field with what's going on in another field is kind of silly, right? I mean, because it's not a fair comparison. In the same way, too, when people critique religion from the field of science or science from the field of religion, it's a silly exercise, right? The rules are all different. The fields are different. What they're trying to achieve is different. The kinds of behavior is completely different. So what am I saying? It is very, very easy to critique one field from another field, right? So obviously science, when it looks at religion, it's all very silly. But then also at the same time, people who are extremely religious, when they look at science, they say, yeah, you see what I mean? And so you may have a bias. You may say, oh no, I'm totally scientist, I'm an atheist. Well, that's what I'm talking about, right? You're on your field. And if we were to use the language of perspective, you're on your perspective, which means you can't understand someone else's perspective. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, because when we read some of these books, actually, by extension, any book that you read in the university, each book is a kind of field. And each book is a self-contained field. Everything you need to know, everything in order for it to be a good book, it has to be right there between the covers. Okay, everything you need to know to understand the author's argument or the story, it's got to be there. Keep in mind that when we think about advanced science books, okay, advanced science books obviously builds on the knowledge from earlier science books. If you think about it, a series, if you jump into season 4, well, sometimes or a lot of times it implies that you saw season 1. Not always, but in order to know what's going on, you kind of have to know what came before. So, but for all intents and purposes, for basic books like Machiavelli, The Prince, or Friedman, Free to Choose, everything you need to know has to be there between the covers. And so what you have to do as a reader, right, you have to identify the field broadly, right? Generally speaking, like what is the field that we're on? The first book that we're going to be looking at is Machiavelli, The Prince, and there you have to realize it's kind of a political theory book, maybe. Next, you have to identify the most fundamental and basic rule. Like, what is that operating principle that's guiding all of the knowledge production in this book? You might say perspective, but to be more specific and concrete, we're trying to figure out what that basic assumption is, what is the fundamental rule or goal that's contained in the book. Then you determine if the argument is consistent, if it's possible. So a lot of people will say, oh, I like this book, or I don't like this book. Really, what you want to try to figure out is if the book is hypocritical or consistent. Is it contradicting itself, or is it logically consistent, right? So that's what I do personally. Like, it doesn't matter if you like what a book is saying. If it doesn't make sense, then it's pointless, right? You can't really use the information there because even the book is contradicting itself. Now, and this kind of relates it to the deconstruction as well, you have to understand your own subjectivity regarding the book or the piece of literature that we're going to be reading. And I say that, and I add this primarily because a lot of people say, oh, this book is going to be boring. And so you have to realize your subjectivity is that you hate political theory or you hate this or that. And so therefore you're going to have a negative reaction. Also, on the other end of the spectrum, if you love political theory, maybe you're a political science major, you're like, oh, can't wait to read this. It might not necessarily be the kind of thing that you're accustomed to reading. And so you kind of have to realize what your own subjectivity is. Are you someone who knows a lot, or are you someone who knows very little? And that's also going to influence how you read the book. And if you can identify what the basic rule is, do you like that basic rule? So, for example, books that are on, let's say, creationism, right? That the world is 6,000 years old or something like that. You may not like the basic rule, okay? And so you have to acknowledge that. But is the book itself internally consistent with the basic rule that it posits, okay? And so basically read with deconstruction in your mind, which includes your own subjectivity. So when we're reading books this semester, I'm going to try to incorporate, and in some books it's more prominent of an issue than others. And Machiavelli is the first one that we're going to be reading this week. And it is really, really kind of a interesting, it helps you to understand really what Machiavelli is doing. So you try to spot his basic rule, his premise, or his goal, and then the whole book is going to rest on that basic rule, principle, theory, or conclusion, whatever, what they're working towards, and then you can see how the argument is constructed, okay, which is a kind of a big deal. In other words, a lot of writers will manipulate or try to get readers to see a certain thing in a certain way so that when he gets to the conclusion, when the author gets to the conclusion, you're like, oh, I agree, right? But what did you just agree to, right? What did you accept as true? How did you change your perspective by the time you got to the conclusion? That's something most people really don't consider or even think about. It's not necessary, and so this is my shortcut, my postmodernist innovation. If you understand the basic rule and premise of the book, and so now all you're going to do is see if it's internally consistent, then you really don't have to understand the whole book, right? Because if it's not internally consistent, then there's no need to understand the whole book, right? If you're just trying to gain knowledge because it's inconsistent, it's contradictory, okay? But if it is internally consistent, then, oh, is the argument plausible? Is it something that I can use? So rather focus on how the argument is made, right? So it's not about, oh, I like this or I don't like this. And a lot of people cherry pick information too. I mean, you can do that, obviously, but keep in mind how that whole argument is being made, because you may like certain things, but the only way you can get to that conclusion is have contradiction, right? And if that's the case, then you're also going to be speaking in contradiction as well. And if you approach books this way, it actually helps you to understand the actual content of the book. It probably will happen once or twice this semester. I'll point it out. But for Machiavelli, it does become a big issue. Okay? So I'll see you in the next video.